Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your global look at news from Taiwan. I'm Jeremy Olivier. Taiwan's national elections are just 2 weeks away, and despite intense debates on wages and housing, the China question looms large. That's because China still claims Taiwan as its own. This year, Beijing has again been accused of interfering in Taipei's elections, using economic sanctions, military operations, and more. But it's more than Taiwanese voters that China needs to convince. Over the decade, Beijing has used its influence in international bodies like the UN to push forward its so-called One China principle. But what do these efforts mean to the world? And how can Taiwan counter the challenges China poses to its sovereignty in international space? To learn more about this topic, I'm joined today by Yu-Jie Chen. She's an assistant research professor at Academia Sinica and an expert on international law and cross-strait relations. Yu-Jie, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jeremy.
So let's first zoom out and take a quick look at what's happening on the global stage. What are some things that we commonly hear China say about Taiwan to international audiences?
China has the so-called One China principle, where it claims there's only one China in the world, and the PRC, the People's Republic of China, is the only legitimate representative of the state of China, and that Taiwan is part of China. And that is the most important element and most contested claim in China's One China principle. This is not something new. We all know that China's long-standing position of owning Taiwan. But in recent years, we see intensification of China's legal narratives.
Yeah, let's just talk a little bit about what you mean exactly by legal narratives that China's using.
So international law really depends on state practice, and with consistent state practice, a country asserts its claim that is going to be normalized under international law as general principles. And I think this is ultimately Beijing's endgame, which is to push its position, legal position on Taiwan's sovereign status and say this is something that a lot of countries accept in the world. And one of the most used tactics is to conflate its own One China principle with the UN General Assembly Resolution 2750A. And this is an attempt to internationalize, I would say, its One China principle, making it look like all countries in the world accept China's position.
So let's dig a bit deeper on UN Resolution 2758. What does China say about this resolution, and is that the same view that's shared by the rest of the world, and particularly Taiwan?
So China's narrative is to say the UN resolution equals to China's One China principle. That is, China tries to project this resolution as international consensus over Beijing's claim over Taiwan. But in fact, that's not what this resolution says. That resolution only recognized the PRC as the sole legitimate government of the state of China in the UN and Security Council. It also expelled Chiang Kai-shek's representatives from the UN in 1971. That's all it is. And Taiwan's sovereign question, or the question of Taiwan's international representation, was never discussed in the voting of this resolution, and it did not appear in the text of this resolution. And so it's very important for international society to clarify the scope of this resolution, because China is now using this resolution to block Taiwan's participation, when in fact there's nothing in this resolution that says about Taiwan's sovereignty or representation. In fact, now the Taiwan government is seeking not the representation of the Chinese state, but rather the representation of its own 23 million Taiwanese people. And that's a very distinctive position from that of Chiang Kai-shek under authoritarian rule.
Do you think so far that this approach that Beijing is using is working?
I think Beijing, with increasing influence in international organizations, has been able to exclude Taiwan from a lot of these international bodies. And so Taiwan really doesn't have a voice on these institutional platforms. There are other countries that indeed accept Beijing's claim over Taiwan, although there are powerful democracies like the United States and Japan that don't concede to Beijing's claim over Taiwan. And this is a very crucial distinction because we have to understand that one China principle is only China's diplomatic relations. It's not international law. It's not universally accepted by other countries in the world.
So we've been discussing the international community's response to China's legal narratives about Taiwan. But the truth is, as you mentioned, that most countries have their own one China policy that differs from China's interpretation, and Taiwan's no exception. So Yu-Jie, I want to zoom in now on how these narratives are impacting Taiwan's elections. But first, let's see how one of the country's political parties, the KMT or Kuomintang, is approaching One China. And that's their 1992 consensus. Have a look. The 1992 consensus refers to an unwritten agreement between the KMT and the Chinese Communist Party. Under it, both sides agree there is one China, which includes Taiwan. But they're free to interpret that as they want. For the KMT, that's the Republic of China, Taiwan's official name. But for the CCP, it means the People's Republic of China. Basically, the two sides agree to disagree. But how did this idea come about? To answer that, we'll need to go back a bit. For much of the 20th century, the governments in Taiwan and China had no official contact with each other. That changed in the late 1980s when Taiwan began shifting to a democracy. By the early 1990s, the two sides agreed to hold a series of talks to begin normalizing relations. But for those meetings to happen, they had to agree on Taiwan's status. That's how they arrived at the One China Different Interpretations formula. It wasn't until years later that a KMT official gave it the name 1992 Consensus.
Today, we continue to prove that it is useful and it's also a guardrail to slow down, to ease the cross-strait conflict, cross-strait tensions. So I think this is very important for the regional stability and peaceful environment.
You can watch the full report on this controversial concept at the TaiwanPlus website. Yu-Jie, let's bring it back to you now. We've just watched this report about how the KMT is approaching One China with its 1992 consensus. So has this approach been effective?
1992 consensus is not very effective in countering China's One China claim because the 1992 consensus is essentially a political formula by which the KMT can say that we agree there's one China, but there are different interpretations that we are going to use, and our China is the Republic of China. But when you talk about this to international audience, many would not get the nuances that the KMT is talking about. And that is why the DPP rejects any claim of one China, rejects any notion of one China, and to highlight that Taiwan's identity is a state distinctive of China. And I think that's because the DPP realizes that any discussion of one China will simply fall into the trap of the one China narrative and would not be able to help Taiwan expand its international presence.
You've talked about the DPP's criticism of the KMT's formulation, but the DPP has also kind of come in for criticism about its approach to China as well in cross-strait relations, particularly its party charter. You know, critics point to the fact that the DPP has never given up its original goal of achieving Taiwan independence. So if the DPP were, say, to win again in this coming election, would this stance on this issue pose concerns for Taiwan's security?
That's a very good question. Indeed, the DPP still keeps the reference of the need to build a Republic of Taiwan in its party charter. But we also know that to take on a more moderate approach in order to appeal to voters, the DPP also in 1999 adopted a resolution that basically says there's really no need to push for de jure independence because Taiwan is already an independent state and its name is Republic of China. So we see this sort of revision of the DPP's approach. We also have to see that there are other constraints on the DPP's approach. The US does not support Taiwan independence. It has said that again and again. And the DPP understands that to maintain cross-strait security, it has to win the US support. So I think the current leader, Tsai Ing-wen, and the DPP's presidential candidate, Lai Ching-te, well understand these dynamics.
We now have a third party that has gained in a lot of popularity since 2020, the Taiwan People's Party, headed by former Taipei Mayor Ko Wen-je. Can you just talk briefly about this party and its presidential candidate's approach to dealing with China?
So I should say it's still not easy to parse Ko Wen-je's policy in concrete terms because the TPP doesn't have a government track record. And so far, Ko Wen-je has only talked about his China policy in abstract terms. So we hear that he stated his position against pursuing Taiwan independence or accepting unification under coercion. But other than that, there doesn't seem to be a lot of concrete information, except for some fancy slogans such as the two sides of the Taiwan Strait belong to one family. But we don't see a lot of policy details so far. And this uncertainty, this ambiguous position, I think, is intended by Ko Wen-je because he wants to have room once he is elected to talk to Beijing. For Beijing, he's a clean slate. On the other hand, Beijing is also unclear about Ke's position, I'm sure. So this leads to more uncertainty as to Beijing's reception of Ke's approach.
The elections are still a couple weeks away and anything could happen. We can't make predictions, but regardless of who's elected come January 13th, what do you think is the best way forward for Taiwan in managing this relationship?
I think no matter who will win the presidential office, Beijing surely is going to maximize its efforts to isolate Taiwan internationally. That's because any concession will be seen by Beijing as a potential precedent for Taiwan to expand its international role more generally. And therefore, Beijing has always been very careful with making any concessions. If there's a DPP president in the next 4 years, Beijing definitely will tighten its control over Taiwan's international role. And so I think Taiwan really has to, I don't think there's a quick and easy fix for Taiwan to attain, but Taiwan should keep a very principled and consistent approach instead of having different policies under different presidents. What Taiwan should do is to have a steady position that asserts Taiwan's own claim to represent its 23 million populace and to assert its identity that is distinct of China's. And that is an approach that will be required under international law for any state to claim itself as a state.
Yu-Jie, that was a really illuminating conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the show today and sharing your thoughts.
Thank you.
This has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. For more stories from Taiwan and around the world, please follow us on social media. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
For more stories from Taiwan and around the world, download the TaiwanPlus app.